Cortland Simmons with you here with the Horse Racing 2018 Racing Report here on CSTV. And right now, Justify's racing career, the Triple Crown winner, is in limbo. Most people would believe, some are speculating that the plan was to retire him soon after the Belmont Stakes, if he could win the Triple Crown. And more than likely, it was going to be a Smarty Jones scenario, or even if he lost it, he had proven enough as a Derby and Preakness winner to be in a great position to have a pretty lucrative breeding deal for his stallion career. Obviously, when you run a horse afterwards, many say that the risks, of that value dropping are increased, when you have a horse of his stature. But, at this point in the game, especially when you are replacing a stallion, the sire, much in the way Fusaichi Pegasus, being a son of Mr. Prospector, who had died a few months before that 2000 Derby, the first run for the roses of the 21st century, where he, of course, was sensational. Did not go on to win the Triple Crown like a lot of people thought when he sprouted wings, hence, very much to his running, pretty much to his namesake, sprouting wings like Pegasus in the stretch. He was still going to be a tremendous entity as a stallion prospect to replace and to preserve the Mr. Prospector bloodline in a very high-end fashion. Here's a Mr. Prospector that can not only go two turns, but he's even an upgrade on previous stake winners by that prominent stallion by being able to run 10 furlongs. So in the case of, Scat Daddy, the sire of Justify, and quite a few other horses on the Derby trail, some of who are still going to be, candidates and players in the road to the Breeders' Cup and the stakes surrounding the World Championships at Churchill Downs, the home of the Kentucky Derby, where, of course, it's deserving of a well and a very, very popular host. Makes the Breeders' Cup that much more interesting because you have horses, in many cases, in all the editions the Breeders' Cup has been held at Churchill Downs, horses coming in from the Kentucky Derby, so you can kind of, look at previous form based just on the Derby. But it's an upgraded situation where you're running against, in theory, better horses, older horses, more established adversaries or rivals. But that's not literally the case, and we'll talk more about that as we get closer to the Breeders' Cup. But for right now, what's interesting is going back and getting back on point to the Scat Daddy and the bloodline issue and the breeding situation. He is taking Scat Daddy's place, his sire's place. Scat Daddy died a few short years ago. So the bloodline is still there in many ways, with some of his progeny out there, a number of the 3-year-olds, including Justify himself, and Mendelssohn, who, of course, flopped in the Dwyer. And now, of course, the question mark that surrounded him before the Kentucky Derby was answered in the the most unflattering manner by finishing last on an off racetrack, which wreaked havoc on a lot of horses. He could be excused for that. Now, that is, becoming, it's metastasized into something of a bigger cancer, and more of a sort of a dark cloud over the horse. But either way, he's a son of Scat Daddy, a $3 million purchase owned by the Coolmore magnate and trained by Aidan O'Brien. But so therefore, the Scat Daddy, line is going to be preserved, with Justify being at the highest end at this point from a stallion value in terms of breeding fees and rights and syndication packages. So, even if he were to run a couple more times and lose both races, even if he ran poorly, obviously numerically his value may drop on some level, but not to the level where, people are going to say, well, we don't want him as a stallion anymore. Any Triple Crown winner is going to be, very much, a lucrative deal for those connected with that horse and all of the entities that will have an interest in this horse. But Bob Baffert's not going to send this horse out if he doesn't think he's absolutely ready to run and believe that there's less chance that he would get injured and have the whole thing fall apart, which we all know, no one wants to see a Barbaro situation or any kind of catastrophic injury. You're basically trying to get through a short window and maintain an excellence, a level of excellence that, of course, carried him to the Triple Crown that you hope would even yield even better performances, or certainly equally as scintillating in his post Triple Crown competition. So that's just something that right now is really, to be quite honest with you, I think a lot of people, there are some people that are upset, angry that, oh, the horse is going to be retired. But Smarty Jones didn't even win the Triple Crown. And the diagnostics that John Service, his trainer, and what was going on with him physically, a lot of people, myself included, didn't completely believe the story. I believe it was a situation where he had some people, small time people, in terms of the grand scheme of things. John Service had been a very successful trainer prior to Smarty Jones. He had a very, very nice filly named Jostle. And he had some top stakes performers working the Midwest or the tri-state circuit, and occasionally popping up at Belmont Park or Saratoga. Not quite the powerhouse conditioner of a Bob Baffert or a Todd Pletcher. But, winning the Kentucky Derby elevates any trainer, whatever success level he or she has had going into a Triple Crown event, to a higher, to greater stature. So when they won the Kentucky Derby, that was it. The Preakness was a bonus, and running for the Triple Crown created the frenzy, the Smarty Party. And I think that even as exciting as it was, as Aaron Greider said when they did a race replay of Smarty Jones losing the Triple Crown after his 3.5 length lead diminished stride for stride, in the final stages as Birdstone got by in the shadow of the wire, he made a great point. As exciting as all this was, I'm pretty sure they're glad it's over with. Obviously, they would have preferred to have won the Triple Crown. I think anybody, that goes without saying. But I think that, given all of the breeding interest, the buzz around this horse, which to me was overrated, but to be expected, everything is, as Jack Whitaker said, the Kentucky Derby, everything is in, the volume is turned all the way up and everything is in capital letters. So everything's just, tenfold, blown out of proportion. But he was an exciting horse, and unfortunately, he didn't get a chance to redeem himself, his Belmont loss, by running, let's say, in the Pennsylvania Derby, which would have been a homecoming affair for him because, the trainer, the breeder, all based, pretty much in Pennsylvania. Smarty was bred there, and that would have elevated what now is a $1 million Grade 1 after the Travers, sandwiched in between the top races for older horses as a prep to the Breeders' Cup. That would have been, like I said, box office if he had run in that race, as opposed to just running in the Travers, although it is conceivable that had he come back, he could have run in the Travers and still run in the Pennsylvania Derby. But running in the Pennsylvania Derby, maybe coming back to Belmont, all those things, to run in the Woodward or the Jockey Club, all those things, of course, have all gone by the boards. And it's disappointing. And there were people that were, to me, it feels like people are less upset about that than Justify possibly being retired. And this is a horse who went undefeated to win the Triple Crown, and not only undefeated to join Seattle Slew as the second undefeated Triple Crown champion, but the first to sweep the series as an unraced 2-year-old. As Matt Bernier from the Daily Racing Forum so eloquently stated after the Triple Crown, just try to digest that for a moment. He's an uncommon talent. So you don't want to run the risk of the horse getting hurt. You run Justify, he breaks down or has an injury that could prevent him from having a stallion career, or he has to be put down, the way that Barbaro was. I mean, nobody wants to see that. So I think that you have to you have to lean toward the side of caution. But if this is an ankle injury that can be taken care of, there's no question he could run next year as a 4-year-old, and it could be, taken care of well before any of the top races, including the Pegasus at Gulfstream in late January, Super Bowl weekend of 2019. This is something that could be taken care of in a matter of weeks, where he could be, a campaign to run as a 4-year-old could be mapped out. That would be what everybody would love to see. If we can't see him now, it'd be great to see him as a 4-year-old. This is an injury that may even be one in which he could run this year, and even if that meant maybe missing the Breeders' Cup, he could still compete and then go on and run as a 4-year-old. But what they're trying to do, the connections, is to maximize, the sort of in laser light fashion, the short window situation. They want to run him. They want to get him to the Breeders' Cup and try to win the Grand Slam the way that Pharaoh did, the Triple Crown and the Breeders' Cup Classic, and go out in a blaze of glory, the way that Pharaoh did, and have a fairy tale ending, stay undefeated. If he were to have a prep and he, is still has an unblemished record, that is what That is what you're ultimately looking for. For me, if I'm training this horse, I'm in the position of I would like to run him a little bit, but we also know that the way business is conducted, as Ahmad Zayed said, in terms of when talking about Pharaoh, it's not as economically feasible and viable and sensible to do that. But I think all fans want to see horses run a little bit more, and unfortunately, we live in an era where that's not going to happen, especially after you win, the Triple Crown. We've seen horses that ran in the Triple Crown races that lost form and were retired, weren't even given a chance to rehabilitate and become viable 4-year-olds, and we can name 2 of those, and that would be Exaggerator and Nyquist. Nyquist, who had sort of had Exaggerator's number, beat him in the Kentucky Derby one more time, and then Exaggerator turned the tables on him in the Preakness. Nyquist skipped the Belmont. Exaggerator didn't run well there. They met again in the Haskell, and Exaggerator beat him one more time, starting to kind of even up the score there. And then Nyquist skipped the Travers, and this is where Arrogate came on the scene and blew Exaggerator and everybody else's doors off to set the track record, breaking General Assembly's record, trained by the late Leroy Jolly, who died in the weeks leading up to the Triple Crown of 2018. And, those horses were retired. Exaggerator probably shouldn't have run back in the Pennsylvania Derby, where he and Nyquist finished, I think, 6th and 7th, respectively. Nyquist was retired. He wasn't even brought back to a racetrack we know he likes at Santa Anita, a racetrack, Exaggerator had also been successful at. And neither one of them were freshened up to run in the Breeders' Cup with or without the aid of a prep, and they were both retired. So retiring a horse that's had an impeccable, spotless resume like Justify, you have to entertain that scenario unfolding the minute either before or after he crossed the finish line first to complete the Triple Crown in the Belmont. That was in the thinking. That, when asked, Bob Baffert, told the press that our intent is on running him. But I think that, Bob's been through the wars of the Triple Crown and top graded stakes since he burst on the scene in the 90s, culminating with his first Kentucky Derby with Cavanier, where he lost right on the wire with Grindstone way on the outside, with Jerry Bailey, our colleague from NBC, aboard for Wayne Lucas, and where Bob thought that was it for him. You never hear about me again, never get back to the Derby, and as we all know, history has told a different story. And I just think that that when you really look at things, and especially when you have depth in your barn, like a Pletcher or a Dale Romans, or Chad Brown, you can it tempers the loss of retiring a horse like that. And especially, and one thing that people forget that really, really can, what would be the word, eliminate withdrawal symptoms from losing a horse of the caliber of Justify is those millions of dollars. Try $75 to $100 million or $50 to $100 million, depending on where you want to put a numeric range. That's a lot of money. And even though it's hard to come by horses like that, you still have a chance with that kind of cash flow to look around and have the cash flow to buy horses at the top end, the middle, or the middle market, as they call it, and anywhere near on the bottom end and get a bargain buy. Maybe not to the extent of Real Quiet at 17,000, and he almost won the Triple Crown, or 17.5 like Seattle Slew, who did win it. But you have that wiggle room, and when you have clientele, you can, as flippant as it may be, or as you can always there's a good chance you can get a horse back. Seems like the top trainers now, the chances of getting a high-end Triple Crown eligible, worthy type of horse to be on the trail or be a grade 1, grade 2 top flight horse seems to be a little bit on the higher level now than it used to be. So there's just much more entities, not having to be a private trainer for Claiborne Farm or Calumet, where that's when there was a monopoly. And even then it was still a little harder to find that one horse, even though they had the monopoly in being able to find them because they had the money and they had, as I said, they had sort of a gridlock on everything. But now there's no longer 3 networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. There's that kind of monopoly is gone now with cable and the internet and so forth, and it's no different in horse racing. So right now I think that you had to entertain the fact that Justify, and some people think that Bob Baffert's faking the fact that this horse has an ankle issue, which surfaced, subsided, and now it's resurfaced. Well, if that's the case, whether it's true or not, then that the beginning to expedite him or to send him to the breeding shed or whisk him away to the breeding shed is expeditiously. It has begun, and they're just hanging out with him now until they decide, okay, well, I guess it's time to get him on the van and get him to Kentucky and put the breeding, and put the ink on the dotted line and get this breeding. And sign the packages and proceed to get his breeding career started. But I think, again, to me, here's the scenario for Justify in terms of running before the Breeders' Cup. Haskell's out, coming up in a couple weeks. That's out. The Travers is off the table. You could find a prep, a two-turn prep, even a conditions race that could get him ready for the Travers. But that's a tall order, even for a horse of his ability. The Woodward at 1.125 I always thought with the Haskell as the prep was the ideal. Let the other 3-year-olds beat each other up, carrying 126 pounds at 1.25 and let us run a week later, get the extra time to go 1.125 which we know is a good distance for us, carrying a 121 for a nice amount of money. The Woodward carries, a lot of weight economically as well. And it would be a great race for a 3-year-old, a Triple Crown winner to win just as much as the Travers, even though the Travers is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a 3-year-old to win that. And what better way as a Triple Crown winner than to accentuate your resume than to win the Midsummer Derby and to, again, face, engage, and hold off all comers and show no chinks in the armor one more time at 1.25 It would be ideal, but that's off the table. No sense in even getting into any longer a dissertation about that than him running in the Woodward a week later. It looks like the Jockey Club Gold Cup is out. That would be 121 pounds at Belmont, a track we know he likes, at 1.25 which would be a great prep for him. But what it looks like right now is he's going to me, if I'm, in charge of Justify or assisting as Jimmy Barnes does for Bob Baffert, what I would do is to say, look, we don't have to literally run in a stake to get him ready. Let's try to find a conditions race just the same way that we did when his career began, when they were trying to get a race to fill and a race to card for Justify to get him going on what, after his first or second start, became a accelerated package to get to the Kentucky Derby. Bob Baffert just realized, maybe I can get this horse to the Derby. Let's give it a shot. And everybody knows what happened after that occurred. So he could get Justify into a conditions race, or there is something on the late Del Mar schedule or the Oak Tree meeting at Santa Anita within the first 10 to 14 days of September. Get a race into him, even if it's only a flat mile, and he runs the risk of running into some other speed horses where if he's not, 100%, he could get beat. But at a mile, that's a distance, even a mile and a 16th, where there are some threats. What happened to Arrogate coming back after too prolonged a layoff in the San Diego? Again, we can't just say unequivocally for sure that wouldn't happen to Justify, because no one thought Arrogate was going to get beat in the San Diego by Accelerate, who's going to try to defend his championship this coming weekend, in the coming hours as we speak. But to me, it would be a good spot for him. Obviously, he's going to be, in some ways, theoretically, a little bit vulnerable, because you never know after such a prolonged layoff. But you would expect Bob Baffert is going, in his mind, to give that horse every chance to run well enough to move forward, get enough time for the Awesome again, stay in California. The shipping dynamic is probably gone, to run him at Belmont, put on a show in New York, running at a place where he knows he likes. Now it's all about doing things in a conservative, methodical manner. And you do that by running him in a conditions race in California. Don't ship him. Run him in the Awesome again, where he may hook Accelerate there. And then from there, just hope that that's enough to get him ready once, shipping him to Kentucky, to put him in a position where you would think that late October, early November, he's going to like Churchill Downs as much at that point and at that juncture as he did in the days and the hours and the minutes leading up to the Derby, the Kentucky Derby on the first Saturday in May. So you would think that he's going to like it just as much in the fall as he did in the spring. But you're just hoping that 2 races will be enough and that there isn't a fatigue factor, that he runs well, gets fit, doesn't get fatigued, and recovers nicely in order to be able to run the kind of race that a lot of people would expect at 1.25 at Churchill Downs, the home of the Kentucky Derby, for the Breeders' Cup for 2018. That is being cautiously optimistic, but you also have to be realistic and not even guard it, but just realistically, you know that there's a chance that none of the above, none of these scenarios will unfold, because initially I had said that the ideal situation for Justify, because I believe he's a sturdy enough horse to handle just a little more than Pharaoh. Keep in mind, Bob Baffert said that after the Preakness, a race in which Pharaoh got a tremendous break competition-wise, he went hard early, and then he was able to coast home because none of the horses on that off-track reacted to the sloppy going anywhere near the way that Justify's competition did, which, again, that has been litigated on previous pieces that I've done, in which, Justify's opposition ran much better on, and therefore he just wasn't able to, open up and win by open links, and he ran a better time than American Pharaoh, and that's been litigated, even though people think that wasn't as impressive. But the point is, after that race, Bob Baffert made it clear in the press, to the press, that Justify came out of the Preakness better than Pharaoh did. So, I think that given that, and just the fact that maybe they want to, do things a little different and with a particular individual versus the previous superstar, that the Haskell, the Woodward a week afterwards, giving them the extra week, letting the 3-year-olds bang each other up in the Midsummer Derby and the Travers. Haskell Woodward a week later, carrying 121 at a mile and an eighth, and then running in the Jockey Club Gold Cup at Belmont, mile and a quarter, 121 pounds, and then shipping to Churchill. That, to me, was an ideal situation. Possibly the Haskell Pacific Classic, awesome again, Breeders' Cup Classic. Haskell, Travers, awesome again, Breeders' Cup Classic, although I don't like a horse cutting back to a mile and an eighth after a mile and a quarter. But it has worked. It's been effective. But for me, making creating a path from a mile and an eighth and staying at a mile and a quarter, from a mile and an eighth, mile and a quarter progression back to the mile and a quarter and staying at the 10 furlongs, to me would be a great, great path, projected path for a horse going to the Breeders' Cup. But all of that's off the table now. Now you have to, call the audible. Like any good quarterback, you just got to know when to make split-second decisions. And in this case, it's not literally tenths of seconds that Bob Baffert and his team has to evaluate. At this point, you have to, take the position that he's leaning toward retirement for this horse. That's the easy route. So, that's just something that you have to really, prepare yourself for, that he's not going to ever run again. But if they can put something together, if that ankle can get better during the month of August and they can get a breeze or two into him, my guess is going to be that they are going to try the Pennsylvania Derby. And then, after a prolonged layoff, that's going to be a decent field, mile and an eighth, to come back in that race and then take another 6.5, 7 weeks off to get ready for the Breeders' Cup. To me, that leaves him a little bit short, but it could work. But he's got to be, 100% optimum level to do well there and have a chance not only do well there, but recover nicely and be able to move forward and be, supersonic in the Breeders' Cup. But to me, they've got to be able to get him right in this coming month of August and be able to get a couple breezes into him. And the plan that I outlined, running a mile and a mile 16th in a conditions race at Sanity, might not be, in the works. They might not be able to get enough breezes to their satisfaction to be able to do that and then run in the Awesome again. Something tells me that he's only going to have one prep. And it's either going to be the Pennsylvania Derby, which I think is an ambitious, I think is climbing pretty high, but some would say the same thing by running in the Awesome again. But he would get a little bit more time. But then again, the argument could be made, the Pennsylvania Derby might be too much time for him to come in and perform well. And you might have ring rust there. And then people would say, you compound it and it would be even more prolonged if he doesn't run before the Awesome again. But at this point, it's looking more like he would run there and not run in the Awesome again and get the break and for another 6.5 weeks and run in the Breeders' Cup. And to me, that doesn't play well. But then again, he's justified. Maybe he can, that regime, that plan can, work to perfection. But I think that running in the Awesome again, it looks like it might be, with no prep before either one of these races, to me it would appear to be a Mount Everest or a Mount Kilimanjaro to climb. It would be very, very tough for me to believe off one prep that he could do it, but it's possible he could do it. The Pennsylvania Derby, to me, could be a good spot, in the 7 weeks to get him ready for the Breeders' Cup could work. The Awesome, again, you run the risk of, if he's not 100%, you have less wiggle room to work with to get him righted for the Breeders' Cup. And if there's a fatigue issue, then you run the risk of a horse regressing. And if he doesn't run even close to his level, he could be on what we call a continued regression, because he hasn't had time to have a prep to really, really get a rhythm going. So the works are going to have to be crucial. Then you have to determine to what extent those works are going to, sharpen him up from a fitness standpoint. So right now it's not ideal, and that's why retirement is so much, it's definitely the leading candidate right now. But I believe that, as I said before, if they could get him right in August to where they believe that he can breeze well enough to at least run a mile and a 16th, that would set him up. And I believe he could, the Pennsylvania Derby would be off the table, but the Awesome, again, would be on. And, he would hook accelerate there, and they're going to find out if he really could go to the Breeders' Cup. And if he runs well, like to be expected, obviously, if they lose, but if it's a quality effort, they're going to certainly want to try to come back in the Breeders' Cup if they believe it's feasible to try to redeem him. But if he can stay undefeated, what do? Do you stay, do you stay perfect and stay in California and then ship him to Kentucky and retire him? I think if he wins the Awesome again, they would have to believe that, knowing that he loves Churchill Downs and he seems to relish the mile and a quarter, they would want to run him back in the Breeders' Cup and try to win the Grand Slam. So we're just going to find out if that is going to be something that's going to be part of the news landscape for 2018. A lot of people are obviously, you have to already be prepared that he's not going to run again, and that's something that no one wants to look forward to. It's like prison. You can never be prepared for that. So we're just going to have to wait and see. We're going to keep you updated on Justify News and all the other top 3-year-olds and handicap horses in North America and internationally here on CSTV Horse Racing Report 2018.